Well, Australia is now home to a world-first ocean health lab focused on tackling microplastics in our waterways. Seabin Foundation is the driving force behind the Sydney Harbour facility, which is at the Australian National Maritime Museum. And the Foundation's CEO and environmental geographer, Mahi Paquet, joins us live now. Appreciate your time, thank you. Firstly, just give us a picture of how healthy or otherwise Sydney Harbour, where you're based, is. What sort of condition is it in?
Hi, thank you for having me. The Ocean Health Lab and the Seabins that are spread around the harbour have helped us to understand that on an index, a scale of 1 to 11, Sydney sits at about 5. So it is not completely clean, 11 being the worst, but it is about midway.
Okay, so there's room for improvement for sure. When we look at microplastics in waterways, in the ocean, in the harbour, how micro are we talking, and how do those microplastics get there in the first place?
Yeah, we talk about as small as plastics that cannot be seen from the naked eye. The work that we do works with microplastics that range between 1 millimetre in size up to 5 millimetres, which is the biggest that we can go to call it a microplastics. Bigger than that becomes a macroplastic. We are addressing the problem through doing subsamples of the catches, and this allows us to understand that we can find up to 2,000, 3,000 pieces of microplastics in one Seabin catch, which covers 24 hours. So this gives an idea of how many microplastics we see in the Sydney Harbour. It's only a subsample. It means that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of microplastics floating around the harbour.
So I assume it's more difficult to remove those microplastics than the macroplastics you were talking about. How does that compare to removing oil as well, for example, in terms of those pollutants in the water? Just how hard is that process?
Yeah, indeed. Through the Seabins can remove oil as well through an oil pad that sits at the bottom of the Seabin, our technology. The catch bag is what allows us to secure the microplastics, which goes down to 2 millimetres in size, the mesh, the catch bag. The microplastics get stuck on leaves and branches as well. And by having these captured into the catch bag, we can go down to the size of 1 millimetres in size. Otherwise, other methodology to remove these microplastics are generally based for science purposes, which we call a mantra trawl, and it's only done a few times for scientific analysis. So by having Seabin spread across the harbour, doing 24/7 filtration, we are removing a significant amount of microplastics. In fact, 1.6 million microplastics, I estimate, have been removed from the Sydney Harbour from our 31 Seabin units since 2020. But again, the actual number of microplastics sitting in the harbour are, yes, probably in much more than trillions.
So Mahi, when you look at around Australia, are some parts worse off than others when it comes to microplastics in our oceans? Is it safe to assume that the more populated areas are likely to be worse in terms of the waterway health? And how does Australia compare more broadly to waterways and oceans overseas?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Again, this scale at number 5 shows us that Australia is not as bad as other areas, but microplastics know no boundaries. They spread around even through the air, through the drinks that we drink and the food that we eat, because they become so small when they break down through the UV light and the erosion that happens through them being in the outdoor environments. The degradation of the material means that they break down and enter the food chain. So microplastics have been found in the Himalayas. They have been found in national parks. Cities are often where it starts from, or areas with a heavy presence of industries which engage with manufacturing of plastics. We find a lot of nodals, which is the raw material to create plastics, small, generally microplastics items that are called nodals, and they float around through just being blown out and leakages. So these are examples. We get microfibers that come from ropes and brushes that might be degrading. We find broken microplastics from food packaging that breaks down into pieces, or sometimes we see the layers with different types of plastics. And when they split up, they become microplastics. They never disappear, they just multiply. And that allows them to enter the food chain and our bodies. They contain, unfortunately, toxic chemicals that haven't been studied in terms of the influence on our bodies. And this means that it's unknown the consequences on our health that we're facing by ingesting the plastic.
Yeah, it is a bit disturbing when you put it like that. Mahi Pakwet, really appreciate you talking us through that. I'm sure our viewers will be keen to pop down and visit you there in Sydney Harbour if they get the chance. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Saturday, 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. at the Maritime Museum. We'll be welcoming people on tours to have a look at the Ocean Health Lab where we do analysis, and this will be an ongoing place for people to visit our work and the Seabins that are at the Maritime Museum in Sydney, as well as around the Sydney Harbour. Thank you.
Great opportunity to learn more. Mahi, thank you for that.